News of the Times. Dark Crimes of Old France. A historical true crime compilation. Welcome to News of the Times. From the whispered intrigues of the boudoir to the ruthless quiet of the guillotine. Today we cross the channel for a tour of dark crimes in old France. British and French relations have long been defined by a curious cocktail of admiration, rivalry, and occasional war. But crime, it seems, knows no borders. To this special compilation, we unearth the most chilling and peculiar French cases from our archives. A socialite's sinister end, a missing husband who may never have left Paris at all, and a murder so gruesome it even shocked the jaded offices of Marseille. Prepare yourself for a tapestry of betrayal, scandal, and mystery steeped in wine, whispers, and a very peculiar sort of French menace. Case 1. Inn of Death, 1831. A French roadside inn becomes a centre of horror when travellers begin to vanish, and the truth behind the hospitality is far bloodier than expected. Case 2. The Serial Killer Nun, 1852. Behind her pious exterior, Hélène Girardot left a trail of poisoned households across France, a deadly domestic whose tender care concealed over 40 arsenic-laced murders. Case 3. Murders in Paris, 1856. When a jilted Parisian clerk beheaded his former lover and tried to dispose of her body, the city was scandalized, and thousands queued at the morgue to see the spectacle for themselves. Case 4. The case of Martin Dumollard, 1862. Over 7 years, Martin Dumollard lured young maids into the countryside with false promises of work, robbing, assaulting, and often burying them alive until a single survivor exposed one of France's most appalling serial killers. Case 5. The French Ripper, 1863. Long before Jack the Ripper haunted London, Joseph Philippe, scarred, ruthless, and driven by a thirst for blood, stalked the streets of Paris, leaving at least 23 women butchered in his wake and earning the chilling title, The Terror of Paris. Case 6. The French Ogress, 1905. Twice acquitted, thrice accused, and suspected in the deaths of over 20 children, Jean Weber, once deemed a victim of coincidence, became France's most horrifying child killer, earning the chilling name the Ogress. And in today's end of episode, further particulars segment, a Parisian herb doctor claimed he needed £40 to trek to the Pyrenees for a rare medicinal plant. He was back in 4 days, mysteriously refreshed, and he administered a curative potion, and his patient was dead by tea. Now, if you enjoy your true crime with a dash of dusty intrigue and a faint scent of absinthe, do consider giving this episode a like, sharing it with a like-minded soul, and subscribing for more. It helps keep the lamps lit and the archive from being turned into a haberdashery. Join us now as News of the Times delves into over 2 hours of shocking, rarely revisited French crimes, from roadside murders and innkeeper assassins to stalkers, stranglers, and the terrifying Jean Weber. These are the tales that crossed borders, stunned a continent, and still haunt the archives of history. Case 1. The Inn of Death, 1831. 1831. This episode from 1833 could easily have been the real live inspiration for the notorious Sweeney Todd episodes, which first made an appearance in an 1846 Penny Dreadful issue. Although Sweeney Todd was fictional, the Red Inn located in the remote hills of the Ardèche was not. Tales spoke of a death trap located in the hills where travellers were plundered in their sleep, killed and dismembered, with the remaining body parts being made use of in stews and pâté. This shocking set of crimes from France has become legend and has inspired many a horror story writer of the past. We take a look at the Martin family, their remote inn, and the tales surrounding this death trap. Whatever you do, don't have a meal there. The Red Inn enigma emerged as a notorious incident in the 19th century, wherein a lodger was discovered lifeless with grievously fractured skull. Suspicion loomed over the innkeepers, Pierre and Marie Martin, along with their servant, Jean Rochette. The subsequent legal proceedings, often referred to as the crimes of Péribailly, as the inn was named at the time, or the trial of the four monsters, unfolded as a sensational affair. Alongside the murder charges, the Martins and Rochette found themselves accused of the grotesque crime of cannibalism. This notorious series of murders was said to have occurred over 25 years, from 1803 to 1831. The background. The Martins took charge of the Red Inn, formerly known l'Auberge de Péribailly, in 1805, nestled in the southern French commune of Lanark in the Ardèche. It stood on the periphery of Is-Anlas and La Villette, isolated among a desolate thoroughfare. Pierre Martin, once a humble farmer, and his wife Marie undertook an impressive ascent from poverty. It was rumoured that the Martins had amassed the considerable fortune of 30,000 gold francs, worth approximately £10 million in 2023, but this figure was likely inflated gossip from jealous neighbours. Certainly, the Martins were comparatively wealthy as compared to others in the area. The papers were less than kind in their descriptions of the Martins and Rochette. From the London Courier and Evening Gazette, the 26th of December, 1833, discovery of a gang of robbers and assassins. The French journals of the month mentioned the execution of two persons, man and wife, named Martin, and of a servant of theirs named Rochette. It would seem that this Martin and his wife, who kept a public house or inn, were in the habit for 25 years of murdering and robbing those who took up their lodgings. The house was in a lonely place, and built, it is said, for the very purpose of murder and robbery. It was contrived that if once a person got in, there was no possibility of escape. Long impunity made them so bold that they hardly took any trouble to conceal their crimes, and the country around them was silent on the subject either through bribery or fear. Martin was a man of sinister and atrocious countenance, about 60 years old at the time of his trial. His father is said to have been hanged for assassination, and one of his brothers condemned to the gallows. The wife was 54, hideous in aspect, and said to resemble the infamous Bancal. Jean Rochette, the servant, aged 47, had all the appearance of a ruffian. A nephew, also named André Martin, was put upon his trial at the same time. They all appeared at the bar dressed after the manner of the mountaineers of Ardèche. The Martins were not popular with their neighbours. With the money they had, they were able to enforce their wishes in the area. Retrospectively, neighbours spoke of their fear of crossing the Martin. The crime. On the 12th of October 1831, a horse dealer, Antoine Enjolras, on the search for a missing heifer he owned, stopped and lodged at the remote inn. He was never seen again alive. Investigations ensued which led the magistrates to the Red Inn. Enjolras's body was found shortly afterwards a few hundred feet from the inn. His skull had been smashed in and all of his personal goods were missing. Pierre Martin and his nephew André Martin and the servant Rochette were arrested forthwith, followed a few days later by Marie Martin, an unusual arrest as it was considered improbable at the time that a woman could be a murderess. Whilst under arrest, investigations ensued with inquiries being asked of the previously fearful neighbours. What came out was a series of wild testimony regarding the Martins and their inn. It was stated that the bodies would be cooked in the bread oven, often giving off a foul-smelling stench to the area. That some bodies would be dismembered, with body parts being used in stews and fed to other visitors of the inn. That some body parts would be used in pâtés, yet other travellers would be dumped in the snow with the appearance that they had frozen to death. Travellers in general finding themselves in that remote inn were likely to be robbed and then killed, however their corpse ended up. The trial. The trial of the four monsters, as the three Martins and Rochette were called, took place on the 18th of June, 1833. The investigation had been exhaustive. The prosecution gathered 109 witnesses, although it was thought that the couple had killed over 50 travellers in their 25-year history. The whole of their guilt would be decided on the case of the missing horse trader Antoine Enjolras. Many witnesses testified to having seen body parts, such as dismembered hands, cooking in stews, whilst others testified to blood-splattered walls and foul stenches from burning flesh pumping out of their chimney. Witnesses were also brought forward to recount their own talks or near escapes from death. From the London Courier and Evening Gazette, the 26th of December 1833, discovery of a gang of robbers and assassins. The three Martins and Rochette were tried for the murder of Antoine Enjolras, who disappeared on the 12th of October 1831, and whose mutilated body was found on the banks of the Allier. There were 109 witnesses examined. Vincent Boyer, one of the witnesses, deposed to the following facts. One day in the winter of 1824, I was forced by the severity of the weather to stop at Martin's house, a place called Peyrabel. There were many persons there, and among the rest an old man. Martin's wife asked me to draw near the fire and inquired how much I earned and what money I had with me. She said there was a band of brigands in the neighbourhood and asked what I should do if they attacked me and whether I was a heavy sleeper. I told her I had 30 sous about me and that I slept very soundly. I was frightened at these questions, and it occurred to me that I was in a slaughterhouse. She then put questions to the old man, who said that he was after selling a cow. When bedtime arrived, the people of the house told us in an imperative tone to go to our rooms and no longer concealed their object. The old man saw his danger and said he would sleep in the same room with me, but they told him very dryly that he must sleep alone. When the old man got to his room, he made some objections, and I heard a voice say, "Do as you like. There's no other room for you." I heard his door shut, and the person who conducted him returned downstairs. One of Martin's daughters accompanied me to my room and told me not to leave the door open in a tone of command. When she departed, I examined the bed and found large spots of blood on the sheets. I lay down, more dead than alive, and in about an hour after some person came in to see if I was asleep, turned over my clothes, and finding that I had only 30 sous, did not take them, but went away. 2 or 3 hours after, I heard knocking on the old man's door. "Get up," they said, "it is time," but no answer. Those who made this noise went down to the ground floor and came up again in half an hour. They knocked again, calling out as before. Receiving no answer, they forced open the door, and I immediately heard 3 times distinctly a cry of "Help! Help!" and then only heard inarticulate sounds like those of a pig when the knife is at its throat. During all this time, the daughters of Martin, aged from 25 to 30, were at my door as if to watch me, singing and laughing. In the morning, Martin's wife asked me if I slept well and whether I heard anything. I said I never woke the whole night. I was so terrified that when I got a little from the house, I ran as fast as I could and never stopped till I found myself out of danger. The cross-examination did not shake any part of this evidence. The only difficulty was how he could have been induced to keep it secret so long, and whether it arose from fear or indifference. His testimony produced an extraordinary sensation in court and upon the accused. Their only defence was a simple denial, and their counsel was silent. The witness of the killing. The prosecution had managed to track down a witness from the night of the killing of Enjolras. The witness was a pauper who got his living from begging. From the London Courier and Evening Gazette, the 26th of December, 1833. Discovery of a gang of robbers and assassins. Laurent Chase, a mendicant aged 56, gave the following evidence. 2 years back, returning from a journey to Louvre, I passed by Puy. On the evening of the event, I was taken in a car by a man who I met part of the way to Peyre-Rabel. I arrived after nightfall at Martin's house and asked for lodging. Martin's wife told me to go elsewhere, as they had no lodging for me. I told her if she would let me sleep in the hayloft, I would pay for that and any other accommodation. Martin said, "Will you sleep on the hay?" "Yes," said I, "or wherever you put me." I went in and saw 4 persons around the fire, and together with Marie Armande, there were also 3 men sitting at a table. One of these 3 men said he lost a heifer in returning from the fair at Saint-Cirque, and that he meant to sleep that night with his friend Martin. That man who thus spoke to me was, I have since found out, was Enjolras. The other two men went away, Martin's wife refusing to give them any more to drink. I went to sleep in the hayloft, and Enjolras was within 6 or 8 paces of me. A few moments after getting on the loft, the male prisoners, Pierre and André Martin, came up the ladder to the place where Enjolras was, followed by the woman Martin, bearing a lamp and pitcher in her hand, both of which she gave to the men and returned down. I pretended to be asleep, at the same time watching the movements of the men. They threw themselves on Enjolras, saying, "You must drink this," and instantly I heard a noise as if a man were struck on the head with a hammer. I then heard doleful sounds of "Oh, oh, oh." Two of the men drew near and looked at me, and I thought I heard them say, "He's asleep." The 3 men took up his body between them and conveyed it from the loft. I heard one say, "Hold fast, don't let it fall." When they got down to the kitchen, which is under the hayloft, I heard them say, "We have made 100 crowns this night." They came up again and seemed to survey me with great attention. They came up this way 2 or 3 times, and I heard them again in the kitchen saying that they had not got very much. I rose at daylight, the servant being the only person in the loft. I thanked them for their kindness and offered to pay for lodging. They said they never charged for a bed on the hay, and they asked if I slept soundly, and I said yes. I left the house and mentioned some of the circumstances, but not the whole, to persons who I met on the way to Nice. This witness was cross-examined for 3 hours, but no contradiction was drawn from him. Being confronted with Marie Armande, he persisted in saying that she was in Martin's house on the day he arrived there, the day of the killing. The witness, Marie Armande, a local of the area, was to be a key prosecution witness who would confirm the beggar's story. She was reticent, whether from fear or because she actually did not see anything is unclear. From the London Courier and Evening Gazette, 26th of December 1833, discovery of a gang of robbers and assassins. Many of the witnesses, under the influence either of bribe or menace, contradicted or greatly qualified their previous testimony. Nothing important could be elicited from Marie Armande, although it is certain she passed the night of Enjolras's murder at Martin's. That she did so was admitted by 2 other witnesses who passed the same night in the house, but who also gave their evidence with great reluctance. Whatever might have been her motive, whether friendship or fear, she withdrew from the neighbourhood for a long time, and to avoid appearing as a witness. On the trial, she said she slept at home on the night of the murder and denied all knowledge of it. Of the witnesses who swore to her being in the house, she asked, "It would appear that these people have 2 souls, of which they can afford to damn one. I know I have but one, and will not damn but save it." She named many persons, she said, who could prove she slept at home that fateful night. They were summoned, but not one appeared to prove her alibi. This was her conduct on the first day of trial. On the second day, however, she avowed that she gave her former evidence under the influence of terror. She confirmed that she was at Martin's the night of the murder, that a man came there who said he had lost
a heifer, and that he took supper and went to sleep on the hayloft. A full disclosure was expected when she came to this point, but no effort could draw a word more from her, although importuned by the public prosecutor, the judge, and the jury. She persisted in saying that she heard no cries from the hayloft, although she slept in the kitchen under it, and denied all knowledge of the murder. She acknowledged, however, that she saw the cart arrive at the house and going to sleep on the loft. Despite Marie Armand's reluctance to commit to having seen or heard the murder, her confirmation regarding seeing a cart arrive at the house confirmed other testimony which stated that the body was seen to have been thrown into a cart and dumped a few kilometres away. The trial lasted 7 days. During the first 4 days, the prisoners showed great confidence and laughed at the most appalling parts of the evidence. Their manner greatly altered towards the close of the trial as they realized that the evidence was against them. Possibly the most damaging of all was Rochette's own solicitor, who confirmed that his client, Rochette, was a murderer, but that it was not his fault. He had been forced into the activities by the Martins. Pierre Martin, Marie Martin, and their servant Rochette were found guilty of the murder of Enjolras. Their nephew, André Martin, was acquitted and discharged. On October the 2nd, 1833, the three were guillotined outside of their death inn. Reports stated that there were over 30,000 spectators to watch their doom. A bloody X was placed on a large stone to mark the spot. Legend has it that a dance took place on the same forecourt that very night to celebrate the death of the Martins. 60 years later, the horrific series of murders from the Red Inn were brought up again as the inn was up for sale at the bargain price of 100 francs, which is about approximately £15,000 in 2023. From the Star, the 8th of June 1893, notorious inn for sale. The notorious wayside inn at Peyrebel, which during a period of 26 years was the scene of innumerable murders of travellers, is for sale. This former death trap is situated in a wild spot among the Ardèche mountains. At the time of the murders, it was kept by a man and his wife, assisted by a servant. The crimes of the trio were eventually discovered, and they all perished on a scaffold erected in front of the inn. But the exact number of travellers they had killed was never found out. The price asked is only 100 francs, 1,000 times less, perhaps, than had been made by the many authors who have exploited the horrible legend of Peyrebel.
Case 2. The Serial Killer Nun, 1852. In this episode, it is 1852, Paris in France. Deeply religious Hélène Girardot, who has taken the vows of a convent twice, has a habit of leaving a trail of death wherever she goes. Yet her distress upon seeing members of the family in which she worked seemingly completely real to the people she served, under even managing to fool the doctors suspicious of the deaths. As Hélène stays with the family, steals from the family, poisons the family, and packs her bags to do the same again across France, no one suspects her until her jealousy of a fellow servant leads Hélène to overplay her hand. Hélène Gigardo, a deadly nun who leaves a trail of murder and death wherever she goes. Her kill count is eventually estimated at being over 40 kills.
Hélène Gigardo was born in Brittany in 1803 to poor peasant parents. Hélène was orphaned from the age of 7 and came under the protection of the curé of Boubry, where her aunts worked as servants. Within the household, Hélène learned how to cook, a skill that would come into play for the rest of her life. Hélène's first job involved working for the household of the curé at Séglien. A shepherd girl looking after the sheep of the household reports finding grains in her soup, the soup that had been prepared by Hélène. Nothing is thought of it. Sent out into the world as a domestic servant, Hélène's next job involved caring for the children within a family as well as normal household cleaning duties. This seemed to have been unremarkable. However, Hélène decides to become a nun and takes the vows in the 1820s. Within the convent, Hélène works in the kitchen, further improving her cooking skills. Unfortunately, Hélène also used the opportunity to steal from anyone she could. Tales tell of Hélène stealing from her fellow nuns, visiting churchgoers, and even from the blind. Hélène is discovered and is dismissed from the convent. Hélène moves on to a second convent, where she once again has made her sacred vows. The second convent were unaware of the thefts that Hélène had committed in her first convent. Hélène was one of the primary cooks and became famed for her cooking skill. Whilst her fellow nuns, priests, and visitors were eating her meals, Hélène spent the time rifling through their things, looking for anything that she could steal. Eventually, Hélène moved on to sprinkling arsenic in the food she prepared to poison the nuns wholesale. The nuns became ill en masse, suspecting Hélène of being responsible for the illness to her fellow nuns, but being unable to prove her suspicion, the abbess of the convent asked Hélène to leave. The Lidrogo murders. Hélène next managed a position as cook with the Lidrogo family in Gouin in 1833. François Lidrogo was the local priest in Gouin. He was noted to be a strong and vigorous man. Hélène worked as a cook for the household. Within 3 months, 7 members of the family became seriously ill and died. The deaths were painfully involved incessant vomiting. The illnesses and deaths included Hélène's own sister, Anna, who had come to visit Hélène, the rector's father and mother, and finally the rector himself, François Lidrogo. With each victim falling ill, Hélène was noted for her very solicitous care of each and every family member and seemed to be genuinely upset at each person's death. The death of so many within the family within a 3-month period caused suspicion. Investigations were made with clear inflammation of the digestive tract, but nothing was conclusive. With Hélène portraying the deepest sorrow of the deaths, no action was taken, and the conclusion was that the family had fallen under the curse of cholera, which had similar symptoms to arsenic poisoning. Hélène used the opportunity to steal from the family jewellery and money and then simply packed her bags and left. The Lescuet murders. Hélène moved back to Boubry to take the place of her now dead sister Anna in the household of the curé. Within 3 months, 3 people died whilst Hélène was part of the household. The niece and sister both died, as did Helene's own aunt. As before, when the victims became ill, Helene was highly solicitous, acting as nurse to their every need. She seemed utterly distraught when each member of the household died. There seemed to be no question of Helene's guilt, given her vast displays of grief. The Le Boucher murders. As she always did, Helene collected what items she could safely steal and moved away, this time to Lochmine. Given her past experience within a nunnery and having worked before for clergy, Helene was accepted to work in the household of the widow Le Boucher. The widow Le Boucher quickly became ill and died, despite Helene's careful ministrations. The widow's daughter also became ill and died. Her son, Pierre, who also became ill, declined the ministrations of Helene. He survived. Helene, concerned that people may suspect her, left quickly. By this time, Helene had left a trail of death in Ségliane, Gouin, and Boubery. Both her sister and her aunt had been included in her now death count of 13 victims. The Toussaint deaths. Helen next went into service in the Toussaint household in Lochmine in May of 1835. 4 people died. The maid of Dame Toussaint, the daughter of Dame Toussaint, the father of Dame Toussaint, and finally Dame Toussaint herself. The son dismissed Helene from service. There were vague suspicions, but Helene herself came across inconsolable of their illnesses and deaths. From here, Helene repaired herself to a local convent, where she was admitted as a pensioner. However, her stay there was short. Strange slashings of clothing and bed linen was found in the convent. Helene was suspected and told to leave. The Lecouvret murder. Helen obtained a job with elderly Anne Lecouvret. Shortly after she became ill, she died 2 days later in great pain. Another murder succeeded with a short stay from another kindly woman who took Helene in. The Hittel murder. Helene's next job lasted only a few days. However, it was long enough for the mother-in-law of the household to become severely ill. She died the same day Helene left. Helene's death trail continued as she went from place to place, stealing and killing. More deaths. A young boy of 14 died in the household in which she worked. However, the boy was known to drink vinegar, and it was suspected that the inflammation that could be seen in the autopsy was due to this habit. Helene was not suspected. In 1841, in a different household, the young daughter of the couple died. Shortly after, the father and the older daughter both became severely ill. They survived but suffered from partial paralysis for the rest of their lives. Within a 10-year time span, Helene held a number of jobs acting as cook in different households. During the decade of her various jobs, a suspected 23 people died of arsenical poisoning. Whilst the family were ill, Helene would rob them of money, jewellery, and anything of value that she could get away with. She would then move on to the next family. From some time in 1841 to 1844, no killing could be attributed to Helene. However, a string of petty thefts is laid at her door. It would seem that Helene developed a taste for alcohol during this time, with several small petty crimes relating to stealing from the household wine cellars. The Rabot killings. In 1848, Helene worked in the Rabot household. The young son Albert died after having eaten some porridge cooked by Helene. Helene still maintained her position, but was caught stealing from the wine cupboard 2 months later. Helene was given notice to leave in 2 weeks. The next day, both Mr. and Madame Rabot became very ill. Rabot's mother-in-law next became quite ill. All three survived, but suffered lingering paralysis. The Mont du Monde Hotel in Rennes. Monsieur Roussel was the proprietor of the hotel. Roussel's mother had cause to upbraid Helene for her manners. She became quite ill and remained bedridden for almost 18 months. The attractive younger fellow servant, Perrault, became seriously ill and eventually died. Doctors were very puzzled and suspicious and requested to do an autopsy, but her family declined. Helene was caught stealing wine from the hotel and was let go. 2 weeks later, Helene obtained a place with law professor Monsieur Bidard. It was in the Bidard household where Helene was finally caught. The Bidard household. Helene's next employment took place in Paris, where she was employed as a cook to a university professor, Theodore Bidard. Mr. Bidard already had another servant in his household, Rose, who worked as the charwoman. Mr. Bidard was kindly and was clearly fond of Rose. Helene found the friendly relationship that Bidard had with long-term servant Rose was too friendly. She was sure that Bidard preferred Rose over herself. Helene made a special cake for Rose. Rose became ill almost immediately after eating her special cake. Throughout her short illness, Helene was by her side, caring for Rose. Rose died shortly after and was buried. Monsieur Bidard was distraught at the loss of the jovial Rose. He spoke of replacing her with another, but Helene tried to dissuade him, saying that she could do it all herself. Bidard went on to hire Francoise, a young girl described as sweet in nature. Francoise rapidly becomes terrified of Helene. The friction between the two grows, and Helene clearly dislikes Francoise and is vocal about it. Francoise begins to be attacked by extreme swelling of her face and hands, which rapidly moves to her legs. Francoise is unable to work and is let go. This time, Helene is placed in charge of finding a replacement. Helene chooses Rosalie. Rosalie is spoken to by Monsieur Bidard and told not to be intimidated by Helene. Rosalie is also educated and able to read and write. Monsieur Bidard approaches Helene and asks her to give him an account of the expenses. Helene becomes furious and seemed to think that Rosalie was behind the request. Helene attempted to give orders to Rosalie, but Rosalie refused, stating that it was Mr. Bidard who paid her wages, not Helene. Helene now hated Rosalie, and the bickering between the two continued. Monsieur Bidard finally gave notice to Helene on the 10th of June to leave his employment due to the bickering between the two. For dinner that same day, Helene made a roast and peas. Monsieur Bidard did not eat the peas, although Helene admonished him that he should. Nevertheless, Helene took the remaining meal into the kitchen, where Rosalie ate some of the peas. Rosalie was immediately unwell, with extensive vomiting. The next day, Monsieur Bidard wished to see the remaining peas, but they had gone missing. Rosalie was sent to the doctor, who prescribed an emetic, and Rosalie recovered. The doctor had prescribed soup for recovering Rosalie, which Helene prepared. Eating the soup that Helene had made for her, Rosalie was immediately extremely unwell. More medicine was ordered, this time of Epsom salts. They were carefully dissolved in water and then placed in the way that Helene had made. Rosalie vomited it all up. Rosalie's illness would retreat and revive regularly, with Rosalie becoming weaker and weaker after each bout. Bidard ordered that Rosalie's emissions should be kept, but this order was ignored. Rosalie, in the greatest of pain, died. Monsieur Bidard himself managed to take one of her emissions and lock it away to a place where only he had the key. Helene seemed upset by this. Monsieur Bidard finished his testimony to police, stating that he had thought at least that Helene was a faithful servant. He found that she was not. In the cellar in her chest was found much of his property taken by Helene, including a diamond and a wedding ring belonging to his daughter. Bidard approached the police, explaining his suspicions regarding the death of two of his servants in such a short time frame. The police arrived at the house and approached Helene. Helene quickly said, "What is the meaning of this? I have done nothing wrong. Rose made the cake, not I. Rose put something in the cake to hurt you, sir. I have done nothing wrong, nothing at all." No mention of poison had been made to Helene. Helene is quickly arrested and held. Her antecedents are researched, and police are astonished at the trail of death that appears to be associated with Helene at every household in which she worked. News travelled fast of the killing former nun who cooked delicious poisonous meals. Previous employers came forward now, realizing that the beloved family members had died after one of Helene's meals. All in all, the estimates placed her kill count to be more than 40 people. From the Morning Post, the 19th of December, 1851. Helene Jagado. One of the most extraordinary cases ever brought before a criminal court has just been tried by the Court of Assizes at the Île-et-Vilaine. The prisoner was a female named Helene Jagado, who for several years past has been a servant in different families of the department. She stood at the bar charged with several thefts committed in and since the year 1840, and with 7 murders by arsenic. But the evidence showed that although only 7 cases had been selected as more recent and therefore easier of proof, not less than 43 persons had been poisoned by her with arsenic. The victims were either her masters or mistresses or fellow servants, who had incurred her hatred. In some cases, no motive of interest or hatred could be assigned. The prisoner appeared to have been actuated by a thirst for destruction, and to have taken pleasure in witnessing the agonies of her victims. The suddenness of the deaths in the families where she was a servant excited great sensation, but for a long time no suspicion as to the cause. For the murderess appeared to be very religious. She attended in many instances with apparent solicitude on the persons whom she had poisoned, and so successful was her hypocrisy that even the deaths of the mother and another relative of a physician in whose family she lived raised no suspicion of poison in his mind. The frequency of deaths, however, in the families by whom she was successively engaged excited a suspicion amongst the peasantry that there was something in her nature fatal to those who were near her, and it was customary with them to say that her liver was white, it being believed in that part of France that persons who are dangerous have white livers. The prisoner herself frequently exclaimed after the death of a victim, "How unhappy I am! Wherever I go, death follows me." Witnesses are collected as the prosecution case is built. Rosalie's doctor spoke of his suspicion that Rosalie had been poisoned, but had difficulty understanding how it was being done. Monsieur Bidart was above suspicion, and Helene had been so exceptionally solicitous of Rosalie, with tears regularly streaming regarding Rosalie's state, that suspicions of Helene were allayed. An autopsy takes place of Rose and Rosalie, but the results remain inconclusive. Damaged but surviving Francois is questioned. She explains that Helene wanted full control of the household, with all decisions and control of the money falling to her alone. She explained that when she would not eat, Helene became very angry and would throw the food out. A neighbouring domestic servant spoke of a conversation she had had with Helene. Monsieur Bidart and Rosalie had gone to his country villa, leaving Helene behind. The witness stated that Helene railed about Rosalie having been taken to go to the country on the trip, exclaiming that Bidart thought that everything Rosalie did was perfect, but that she, Helene, was left behind to do the housework. Members of the family who had loved ones die with Helene in their household came forward to give evidence. They all told a similar story. Helene would move in, her meals were delicious. Over time, people within the household would start to become ill with extreme emissions. Helene would care for the victims, extensively grieving heartily upon their death, and it was for this reason that she was never suspected. Helene is questioned hard about obtaining of arsenic, but Helene completely denies any knowledge of arsenic and what it actually is. She categorically states that there is no witness who could testify that she had ever had arsenic. It is surmised that Helene had stolen the large amount of arsenic in the first household with 7 dead. The disappearance of the arsenic in the household had been noted, but there was no proof that Helene had been the one to steal the arsenic. The prosecution believed that Helene had continued to carry the alleged stolen arsenic with her in all her travels, but had suddenly gotten rid of it when she was suspected. From the Morning Post, the 19th of December, 1851. Helen Jagado. The case on which she was brought to trial were established by the evidence beyond the possibility of doubt. The prisoner throughout the trial, which lasted 10 days, constantly declared that she was innocent, and seemed to anticipate an acquittal on account of there being no proof of her having had arsenic in her possession. It was proved, however, that in one of the families in which she was a servant some years ago, there was a large quantity of arsenic which was not locked up, and that it had suddenly disappeared. Tins of arsenic had without doubt been taken by the prisoner, and had served for the commission of the successive murders. In court, Helene denied killing anyone. She was initially accused of killing 17 people, but for the purpose of the trial, Helene was charged with 3 murders and 3 attempted murders. With the vast collection of witnesses all stating the same pattern, all with dead family members who had been under Helene's tender administrations, the case becomes overwhelming, even with the lack of arsenic found in Helene's possession. From the Morning Post, the 19th of December, 1851. The only defence set up for her was founded on phrenological principles. It was contended that the organs of hypocrisy and destructiveness were developed to a degree which overpowered the moral faculties, and that although it would be unsafe to leave her at large, she ought not to be condemned to capital punishment, the peculiarity of her brain rendering her rather an object of pity. This defence failed entirely, and the jury having delivered a verdict without extenuating circumstances, the court condemned her to death. In December 1851, Helene was found guilty. Helene seemed astounded throughout her time in prison that she'd been found guilty. There had been no arsenic found on her person, and she had sold any incriminating articles that she had stolen. She remained convinced that there had been a mistake and she would be found innocent. As she waited her execution, she continued to hold out hope that she would be given clemency. However, there would be no chance of this. Helene was looked upon with horror. The added horror of her crimes was that she had been a nun, taking sacred vows twice. From the Halifax Guardian, the 7th of January 1852, the poisonings in France. The female named Jagado, who was recently condemned to death by the Court of Assizes, has appealed to the Court of Cassation against the condemnation on the grounds that there had been certain irregularities in the trial. The court rejected the appeal. Although only condemned for 7 poisonings, the evidence in the trial tended, it may be remembered, to prove that she had been guilty of 45 killings. In Rennes, France, on the 26th of February 1852, Helene, 49 years of age, was led to the guillotine. Despite the cold weather and snow, thousands of people showed up to watch Helene's beheading. Helene eventually confessed her crimes when it became apparent that there would be no chance whatsoever of clemency. She recounted all of her killings systematically to her priest for her final confession. From the Morning Advertiser, the 3rd of March 1852, the execution of Helene Jagado. The guillotine has just deprived France of one of her most remarkable citizens, the infamous Helene Jagado, who was recently condemned to death by the Court of Assizes of the Department of Ille-et-Vilaine for having caused the death of not fewer than 40 persons by poison at different times, and she was executed at Rennes on the 27th inst. On being told that her appeal to the Court of Cassation and petition for pardon had been rejected, she asked, "What does that mean?" "It means," said the principal turnkey, "that you must prepare to die." On this, she wept violently. Shortly after, a priest was sent to her, and she confessed her 40 murders, going through each of them in arithmetical progression. At her execution, she was so much overcome by cowardice as to require the assistance of the executioner.
Case 3. Murders in Paris, 1856. In today's episode, we are in Paris and the brutal slaying of a maid in what seems to be a gruesome love story. The tale sounds like one of stalking that has come to a terrible end. The recounting of the murderous tale is graphically descriptive, much more so than we would normally find in the English press. The case at the time was described as the French version of Daniel Good, a famous case in its day which we covered earlier. Interestingly as well, even with the horrific nature of the crime, a dismemberment attempted with bad tools, there seems to be a lingering sympathy with the murderer.
Generally, stories from France would receive a small paragraph. This story made all the papers in England. From the Morning Post, the 7th of August, 1856, frightful murder. The quarter of the Faubourg Saint-Martin had just been the scene of a frightful murder. About 4 o'clock in the morning before last, the attention of the porter of a house in the Rue de la Philadelphie was excited by the noise in one of the upper stories. Fearing that some of his lodgers were about to effect a clandestine removal, he got up and went out of his lodge to see what was going on. Scarcely had he ascended a few steps of the staircase when he met a man who is a clerk in a public administration and occupied a room above, bearing on his shoulders the naked body of a woman with the head cut off. On seeing the porter, and alarmed at the cry which that person raised, the man threw down the body, ascended hastily towards his room, and jumped out of the window on the second floor into the street. The upper part of a shop window on the ground floor broke his fall, and he came onto the foot pavement without having received any injury, and he ran off as fast as he could towards the Faubourg Saint-Denis. Few persons were in the street at this hour, and no one consequently stopped him. Information having been sent to the Commissary of Police, that functionary was soon on the spot, accompanied by a medical man. It appears from the preliminary investigations that the now missing man, about 2 years ago, fell violently in love with a young girl with whom he had resided in the house for more than a year, but she one day disappeared. After searching for her for several months, he at length discovered the fugitive, but notwithstanding his earnest entreaties, she refused to renew her acquaintance with him. It is thought, however, that on Saturday she had come to his room, and that during the night the horrible crime was perpetrated, of which the circumstances are as yet but very imperfectly known. The room, on its being entered, was found in the greatest disorder, and everything covered with blood. The head was found in a pail. It is supposed that the missing man must have accomplished the decapitation with a razor while his victim was asleep. The age of the girl is considered by the medical men to be about from 23 to 25, but nothing has yet been found to prove her identity. The body was consequently removed to the morgue. It is supposed that the now missing man, believing that everyone was asleep in the house, would have carried the body into the street and there left it, thus giving an idea that the murder had been effected in the public road. But the waking of the porter disconcerted his plans. How he intended to manage with the head is by no means clear. The police are making a strict search for him, but no clue to him has been had. The following are additional details. The murderer's name is Poirier. His age is 35, and he was employed as office porter by the Société Immigration Franco-Américaine, whose offices are at that address. On Saturday, the chief employees of the company, on the termination of the business of the day, said that they would go into the country in the evening and stop till Monday, and they left him in charge of the offices. In the evening he went out, and after stopping some time, returned with a young and pretty woman, who went upstairs with him, the concierge making no objection. In the night, the concierge, as already stated, was awakened by a strange noise on the staircase. He got up and found Poirier dragging down by the legs the body of a woman with her head cut off. The chemise of the victim was tied over the neck, probably to prevent the effusion of blood. The concierge, horrified, cried for his wife to come to him, and armed himself with an old sword which he possessed as a retired soldier. He then said to Poirier, "Wretch, what have you done? You shall not pass." "What matters," said Poirier, "whether I pass or not? I am avenged on a woman who has made me suffer a good deal, and I have no wish to escape. Arrest me, if you like." He, however, returned upstairs, and the concierge and his wife hastened to summon the police. The police at once proceeded to the man's bedroom on the 6th story, but did not find him or any trace of the crime. They accordingly descended to the offices, the door of which was open, and found that the murder had been committed in a kitchen attached to them, which is fitted up as a bedroom. The first object that attracted their attention was an iron balance forming part of a letter copying press, and as it was covered with blood and had hair adhering to it, it was evident that the victim had been beaten about the head with it. On a table was a knife stained with blood. Near the bed, which was also stained with blood, a fact which shows that the young woman must have been struck on the head whilst lying in it, was a large tin pail, nearly filled with blood, and in this pail was the head of the victim. The head, according to all appearance, had been cut off with the knife, but as the knife was old and much injured by use, the operation must have been a long and difficult one. The fleshy parts of the neck, for example, were not cut through, but hacked. A carpet by the side of the bed was saturated with blood. On the table were some empty bottles of wine, some biscuits, and other remains of a supper. The manner in which the murderer effected his escape has already been described. The name of the murdered female has not yet been ascertained, but from her dress and appearance she is supposed to have been a femme de chambre, a maid. The crime captivated the Parisians. Focusing on the supposed love angle of the murder, there was sympathy for the murderer and his alleged broken heart. Parisians were also captivated by the ghoulish prospect of seeing the battered and beheaded young woman at the morgue. Parisians in their thousands rushed to the morgue to get a good look at the unidentified woman who had been so brutally beheaded. From the Morning Post, the 11th of August, 1856, the frightful murder in Paris. The extraordinary murder in the Rue de la Fille d'Elt continues to excite profound sensation in Paris. Yesterday, the body was still exposed at the morgue, and the head was fitted to the neck, the hair being so arranged to prevent the place where the head was severed being seen. The deceased appears to have been about 25 years of age, and was rather vigorously constituted, and of average height, but she was not so pretty as first stated. So vast a crowd assembled to view the body that it was expedient to form the persons composing into a line to be admitted 2 by 2, but none of them recognized the woman. The police are making the most active searches after the murderer Poirier, but as yet without any success. It is considered probable that he has committed suicide, and it is supposed that in jumping from the window just before the police went to arrest him, his object was not to escape, but to kill himself. The Canal Saint-Martin was searched yesterday, but no dead body was found there. It appears from an examination of the body that the murderer must have stunned her by blows on the head with the iron bar of the copying press already alluded to. That then he stabbed her with a knife and received the blood which flowed from the wound into the pail, and that then, when she was quite dead, he proceeded to cut off her head. It is supposed that his intention was to dismember the body, but that after cutting off the head, he found that the operation would take too much time, and he accordingly determined to bury her in the cellar. Having completely stripped the woman and enveloped the neck in her chemise, as first mentioned, to prevent the blood from falling about, he put the body on his shoulders with the legs in the air. He descended the staircase, and the arms fell and struck against the step, and it was the noise so occasioned which awoke the concierge. Had it not been for this noise, the man would have no doubt succeeded in burying the body, and he would have had then been able to remove the head, the blood, and the other traces of his atrocious crime. The murderer, who it is stated belongs to a respectable family, is of short stature, slightly made, and of a harsh cast of countenance. He was attentive to his duties and gave satisfaction to his employers. Poirier is finally discovered hanging in the woods from a tree in an apparent suicide, as had been predicted by the police. His body is badly decomposed. He is identified primarily from the clothes and the keys to his room at the lodging house. Empty brandy bottles are nearby. From the Morning Post, the 14th of August, 1856. The late murder in the Rue de la Fidèle. Suicide of the murderer. It has at last been ascertained what has become of Poirier, the murderer of the woman Hadro, in the Rue de la Fidèle. The dead body of a man was on Monday found hanging by the neck to a tree in an unfrequented part of the Bois de Vincennes, and 2 empty bottles which had contained brandy were lying close by. The body was immediately taken to the morgue, and as there were no papers on it to show who the deceased was, the chief of the detective police, who was entrusted with the search after the murderer, was summoned. He found that the corpse was in such an advanced state of decomposition that it was impossible to make a description of it, but the height and the structure of the frame were the same as those of Poirier. The dress, too, consisting of a black frock coat, a dark pair of trousers, and a peculiar hat, the brim been lined with cloth, and a pair of slippers, was precisely that which he had described to have worn on the night of the crime. Lastly, 2 keys were found on the deceased, and one of them turned out to be that of his room in the Rue de la Fidèle, the other that of the outer door of the office of the same address, at which he was employed as a porter. The concierge of the house recognized the 2 keys. There is no doubt, therefore, that the body found is that of the murderer, and it is supposed that he committed suicide on Sunday the 3rd, the day following that on which the crime was perpetrated. A murderer who escaped the criminal justice system. Sadly, little else was known of this case in England. Morgue viewing. However, within the press, the case brought up the French predilection for going to the morgue to look at dead bodies as a form of entertainment. This fascination with the dead was prevalent in the Victorian era, but the French had transformed this activity into a form of entertainment. The Paris morgue became famous and a must-see when visiting. The Paris morgue was known to receive vast numbers of visitors regularly. Depending on the crime of the day, vast crowds could arrive, requiring the police to step in for crowd control. An average Parisian would scan the papers in the morning, noting any particularly gruesome deaths, and arrive at the morgue later to see the corpse on display in the window for themselves. Although the opening of the morgue was to allow family and friends to identify a missing relative or friend, the majority of the visitors to the Paris morgue were tourists. The more gruesome or mysterious the death, as recounted in the papers, the larger the number of people. When the newspapers reported a decapitated or bloody person to be on display, tens of thousands of people were known to attend. From the Crimson, men are crowding and elbowing each other, old hags are pointing towards the glass and croaking to one another. Pretty women are gazing with white faces of pity, but with none the less thirsty greediness, upon some fascinating spectacle. Little children are being held aloft in strong arms, that they too may see the dreadful thing, and they do see, and they toss their tiny wavering arms aloft and crow gleefully. Another article in describing the rush to view a new body writes, "The mob rushes through the doors with savage cries. Fallen hats are trumped on, parasols and umbrellas are broken, and yesterday women fell sick, having been half suffocated." Paris guidebooks offered opening times and advice on the best times to visit the morgue as a tourist. Market stalls and hawkers popped up around the streets of the morgue, selling sweets and oranges for the family day out. The morgue became one of the top tourist attractions of the city. By the close of the 19th century, the morgue had garnered such widespread attention that nearly every guidebook on Paris made mention of it. The social commentator Hugues Leroux penned in 1888, "There are few people having visited Paris who do not know the morgue." Exploiting the heightened interest, local vendors swiftly capitalized on the phenomena. The sidewalk outside the morgue frequently teemed with individuals hawking oranges, cookies, and coconut slices. While other morgues may have drawn tourists, none could match the allure of Paris. In 1864, to accommodate the tourists, a new purpose-built morgue was built and designed to attract the maximum number of visitors, ostensibly as a means to expedite the identification of corpses. Situated behind the Cathedral of Notre Dame, deep in the heart of the city, the new morgue not only commanded a prime location, but also remained open from dawn to dusk 7 days a week, far surpassing the accessibility of any other prominent morgue of its time. The morgue's interior boasted a rather welcoming design, with the exhibition room accommodating up to 50 visitors. Rows of lifeless forms lay on stone slabs behind glass windows. Flanking these windows stood a pair of verdant curtains, reminiscent of those found in a retail establishment, a spectacle likened to a large department store window when the merchandise has been removed on a Saturday night, as per commentators of the time. Attendants of the morgue would hang the garments of the deceased on pegs adjacent to their bodies. Initially, in the earlier years of the morgue, cold water would drip onto their bodies from a tap in the ceiling to impede decomposition. By 1882, this method was replaced by an extensive refrigeration system. The morgue's well-attended exhibitions drew frequent comparisons to theatrical performances. Renowned French novelist Émile Zola described it as an affordable show for all. On rare occasions when no bodies were on display, disgruntled crowds voiced their discontent, complaining that death allowed itself an intermission that day without thinking of their good pleasure. However, when observers labelled the morgue as a theatre, they referred not only to the sight of the lifeless figures, the visitors might also unexpectedly find themselves witnessing dramatic criminal investigations as well. Police frequently brought suspected murderers to the morgue, exposing them to their victims, believing that the shock of seeing the consequences of their actions would elicit confessions. These confrontations became common to the extent that in 1888 the Paris morgue installed electric lights, with the idea of increasing the effect produced upon murderers upon being confronted with their victims. Under the effect of the lights, the confrontations were expected to be much more effective. Remarkably, this strategy proved successful, with Paris police records documenting several instances of suspects who, after initially refusing to cooperate, confessed their crimes upon visiting the morgue. The morgue, as theatre, tourist attraction, and detection, all in the centre of Paris, a French Victorian day out for the whole family.
Case 4. Martin Dumollard, 1862. In this episode, it is 1862 in France. Martin Dumollard, described as a peasant, is on trial for a string of murders dating back to 1855, although it is expected there are many more unaccounted for. Dumollard and his wife live in a backwoods shack in the country. Dumollard would make trips to Lyon, scouting for young girls looking for work positions as a maid. Unsuspecting girls, enticed by the idea of working in a chateau at incredible pay, follow. This astounding case to fascinate with questions remaining as to just how many young girls Dumollard did kill, outrage, and rob.
Background. Martin Dumollard's family originally came from Hungary. There are vague references of Martin's father attempting to escape Hungary due to crimes he had committed there. Most significantly, Martin's father was captured by Hungarian forces, executed and dismembered. 4-year-old Martin and his mother watched the gruesome execution. Martin began work as a shepherd at the age of 8. It is in his capacity here that he met his wife, Marie-Anne Martinet. The couple eventually settled in Dagneux. Martin, by all accounts, was not described as an attractive man, so he was not attracting the young women by his charm and good looks. However, collected statements speak of his good French and his seemingly relaxed manner. His pitch was for him being a head gardener in a chateau, with his imaginary master having sent him out to obtain additional domestic help at good wages. He played the part well, and by all accounts was very believable. From the Express, London, the 1st of February 1862, Martin Dumollard. A man named Dumollard, an ugly villain marked by a scar and a tumour in the upper lip, has been in the habit for 7 years of murdering and robbing servant girls, who he then lured into lonely places under the pretext of conducting them to good situations. The crimes. As we regularly see with serial killers, it is often the last killing which unravels the previous series. Such is the case with Martin Dumollard. From the Bicester Advertiser, the 31st of January 1862, an extraordinary trial for murder in France. The most intense excitement has been masked throughout France by the trial of a man named Martin Dumollard, a labourer, who for the last 8 years has been in the habit of murdering and robbing servant girls under the pretence of conducting them to good situations. 15 cases of murder or attempted murder are alleged against him, and it is suspected that he must be guilty of many more crimes of a similar nature. His wife was indicted as an accomplice. The trial took place at Bourges, in the department of Aisne. The following account of the extraordinary charges against the prisoners is obtained from the official Act of Accusation. On the 25th of May 1861, about 11 o'clock at night, a woman knocked at the door of Monsieur Joly, an inhabitant of the village of Billau, and asked for the protection from an assassin, out of whose hands she had just escaped. Her name was Marie Pichon. She was at once taken before the police authorities at Montleur, to whom she made the following statement. She had come from Lyon, where she had been living as a domestic servant. As she was crossing the bridge de la Guillotine, she was accosted by a countryman clad in blue blouse, with a hump on his back and having a scar and a swelling on his upper lip. This individual inquired of her the address of a registry office and entered into conversation with her. He told her that he was employed as a gardener at a chateau near Montleur, and that he had been sent to Lyon for the purpose of engaging a servant. The place was a most advantageous one, the wages being 250 francs a year, besides prerequisites. Thrown off her guard, Maria Pichon accepted the offer. She at once got ready her clothes, and accompanied by her guide, took the train to Montleur, where they arrived soon after nightfall. The man, putting a box on his shoulder, told Marie to follow him, saying that he intended to take a short cut to their destination. Suddenly, after having passed across several ploughed fields, the stranger stopped in the middle of a meadow and put down the box, saying that he was too tired to carry it any further, but that he would go on for it with the coach the next morning and take it to the chateau. They then resumed their journey, but this incident caused Marie to feel somewhat uneasy. Soon afterwards they came to a hill and began to ascend it. Marie Pichon observed that her companion seemed anxious that she should go first. She had before remarked that he had armed himself with a heavy stick, and now she noticed that he stooped down several times to pick up stones. When they had proceeded a few paces further on, she saw him thrust his hand under his blouse as though he was about to draw forth a weapon. Terrified, she stopped and said, "I see you have deceived me. I will go no further." "We have arrived at our destination," replied the stranger, and at the same time stretching out his arms in the direction of his victim, who saw that a cord with a slip knot was above her head. She dropped a bandbox and an umbrella which she was carrying and raised both her hands, arrested the fall of the instrument of murder. Marie Pichon then took to flight, and she fell several times and bruised herself severely. At last she beheld a light in a cottage window, and in a minute more she was safe under the roof of Monsieur Joly in the village of Ballau. The search made for the box and other articles was fruitless. The disappearance of these so seemed to indicate that the culprit was not far distant, and this supposition was strengthened by the fact that he was acquainted with the neighbourhood. The attention of the officers was directed to the occupiers of a house situated at Meffert, in the vicinity of the place to which the woman Pichon had been led. The authorities took Marie's story seriously. It was also noted that there were similarities to her story and other prospective maids claiming escaping assault in the area over the years. Residents of the area were questioned, and all answers seemed to lead to Martin Dumollard and his wife. Martin was known to the authorities with a criminal record of 2 robberies. From the Bicester Advertiser, the 31st of January 1862. The bad character of the man who resided there, coupled with the dissimulated behaviour of his wife, the nocturnal excursions of the husband, and the striking resemblance he bore to the description of the malefactor who was wanted, induced the juge de paix to proceed to the house of this man, Martin Dumollard, to demand of him an account of how he had employed his time on that night. The embarrassed manner of Dumollard and his wife, their contradictory replies, and the presence in their abode of a quantity of articles confirmed the suspicions which were entertained. Dumollard was arrested and forthwith conveyed to Trevoux, where he was confronted on the evening of the same day with Marie Pichon, who recognized him. The evidence of identity was corroborated by testimony of other persons who had seen the man in Lyon in the company of his intended victim on the day in question. The woman, his wife, who had compromised herself by her false and contradictory statements, and also by the anxiety she evinced to conceal certain suspicious articles, was likewise taken into custody. Investigations. The investigations proceeded. The small house was searched, where large quantities of clothes, personal items, and the belongings of Marie Pichon were found. From the Bicester Advertiser, 31st of January 1862. Several searches were made in the house and resulted in the discovery of a large quantity of clothes, linen trunks, boxes, fragments of lace, and other articles, all likely to have belonged to domestic servants. Among these spoils, of which many bore traces of blood, particular attention was directed to some garters of different forms and colour, which appeared to have belonged to different persons. The police also found some pieces of stuff which had been taken from the box of Marie Pichon, and also articles of clothing belonging to women who had been assassinated. There seemed to be no question as to Dumollard's guilt in regard to the attempt on Marie Pichon. However, the varied number of items found in the house, which would seem to have belonged to a number of different younger girls, aroused questions as to what exactly Marie Pichon had escaped from. Previous reports of missing girls and reported attacks were reviewed, and the beginning of a list of serial killings of young girls began to emerge. From the Bicester Advertiser, 31st of January 1862. The crimes which were subsequently brought to light extended over a period between February 1855 and May 1861. The Act of Accusation recounts a large number of these murders and attempted murders, amongst the most remarkable of which is that of Marie Badet, a young servant of Lyons, and the attempt upon the life of Olympia Albert, another servant. The latter victim being deceived by the promise of 250 francs of wages, unhesitatingly departed with her pretended guide, and after a long journey they arrived at nightfall in the environs of Tramoy. They were approaching the forest of Montrevel, where some days previously the bleeding body of Marie Badet had been discovered, when, affrighted by the solitude of the place, Olympia Albert declared that she would proceed no further, and suddenly quitting her companion, she fled into a neighbouring farmhouse. The Act of Accusation then enters into particulars of two successive attempts made in the months of October and November 1855, the objects being two servant girls, Josephine Charlotte and Jean-Marie Bourgois. Both of them escaped by flight from the consequences of their imprudent confidence, and both lost their luggage and their money. The Act of Accusation goes on to say that from November 1855 to the close of the year 1858, no crime committed by the accused has been publicly charged against him. In December 1858, however, he resumes his diabolical vocation, for by engaging a young servant maid at Lyons, he conducted her to the wood of Montbain, and there, in the middle of the night, he first violated her, and then, having wounded her in the most serious manner, buried her whilst she was still alive. After tracing a number of robberies committed by the same means, the victims always being dependents decoyed from Lyons, who only escaped death by flight and leaving their property in the hands of the accused, the Act of Accusation relates the particulars of the last murder committed by him on the 26th of February 1858, and then concludes by stating that during the 8 years in which the prisoner has pursued his career of crime, 6 of his victims were murdered after being violated, and 9 other girls providentially escaped from their assailant, although 4 of the latter number were compelled to leave in his hands the property which had excited his cupidity. And what of his wife? Surely she must have known what was going on. She and Dumollard were separated in jail, and under intense questioning she admitted her part of the crimes, in that she was aware of what was happening and would take the goods and sell them. She also gave full disclosure of the crimes of her husband, Martin Dumollard. She knew what her husband was doing to the girls, and was able to direct the police to where some of the bodies lay. The bodies that were found inevitably were completely naked. Horrifyingly, it would seem that at least some of the bodies had been buried alive. From the Dublin Evening Mail, the 3rd of February 1862. Fearful murders and outrages in France. The assizes of the department at Saint-Ain in France, sitting at Bourg, are at present engaged in the trial of a man and a woman charged with one of the most extraordinary systems of crime known in the annals of guilt. The male prisoner is named Martin Dumollard, aged 52, and the female is his wife, Marianne Martinet, aged 47. It appeared from the evidence, and indeed from the confession of Dumollard himself and of his wife that for many years back the man had been in the habit of accosting young females who looked like domestic servants, representing himself as a person sent to hire a servant for a gentleman's country house, inducing them to accompany him some distance until they reached a neighbouring wood, and there throwing a cord around their necks and attempting to outrage and murder them. In one very recent instance, a girl escaped from his hands and, seeing the lights of a railway line in the distance, ran in that direction and obtained a refuge. Her description of her assailant, combined with the fact that similar statements had been made at distant intervals by other girls, caused an inquiry to be vigorously set on foot, and Dumollard, who appeared to have no regular mode of livelihood, was suspected. A search was made of his house, and an immense quantity of female garments was found there, such as 40 bonnets, 57 pairs of stockings, 14 dresses, and a heap of corsets, petticoats, chemises, etc. Dumollard, being arrested and identified by the girl who had escaped, confessed that he had been for years in the habit of decoying girls into the forest, but stated that he was only the agent of a gang who employed him for that purpose, and who gave him the clothes for his reward. He denied that he had himself committed any of the outrages or murders. The woman who lately escaped, and several others who likewise identified Dumollard, stated, however, there was no one with him or near him when he attempted the crimes. A search in the forest discovered the dead body of a young woman very recently buried. The body was quite naked, and what was peculiarly horrifying was that the hands were found clasped full of the fresh earth heaped above, and the legs drawn up, thus giving rise to more than suspicion that the unfortunate girl had been buried before life had wholly departed. The skull was marked with 2 terrible wounds. In another part of the forest, another body was in a decayed condition, likewise that of a young woman, and stripped of all clothing. Subsequent researchers, directed indeed partly by Dumollard himself, discovered 2 female skeletons. It ascertained that within some years many of the girls have disappeared from the neighbourhood, some of whom have left their homes with the intention of seeking employment in Lyon or Paris. The bodies which are capable of identification have been fully identified. Among the clothing found in Dumollard's house are several articles bearing the initials of girls whose fate is yet undiscovered. In some instances there are the inner garments which could not have been obtained without violence. Known victims. There has always been a suspicion that Dumollard had killed far more than he had admitted to. His usual modus operandi was to knock the victims, thereby disabling her, rape her, strip her of clothing, and bury her, often alive. The list of known victims are Marie Badet, February 1855, Olympia Albert, March the 4th, 1855, Joseph Charlotte, September the 22nd, 1855, Jeanine Marie Bourgois, October the 31st, 1855, Victorine Perret, November 1855. Unidentified woman's body found in the woods of Montmain in November and December 1855. Julie Farguet, January 18, 1859. Unidentified woman's body found in the St. Croix Mill, December the 11th, 1859. The Laborde daughter in the inn, February 1860. Louise Michel, April the 30th, 1860. Marie Olial Bousseau, February the 25th or 26th, 1861. and the attempted murder of Marie Pichon, May the 26th, 1861. The trial. The trial was a foregone conclusion, with no question of his guilt. Dumollard received the death sentence, while his wife, as co-conspirator, received 20 years hard labour. From the Sheffield Daily Telegraph, the 3rd of February 1862, Crime in France. The trial of Dumollard and his wife, which has caused such a great sensation, was brought to a close today. It was proved that during the last 8 years the male prisoner has outraged and murdered 6 girls whom he had enticed into a lonely place under the pretence of conducting them to situations. 9 other girls who were decoyed in a similar manner providentially escaped. Dumollard was condemned to death and his wife to 20 years imprisonment. The correspondent of the Globe writing on this subject says, "There is a dreadful case of an atrocious land corsair whose foul deeds are in course of detail before provincial tribunal in Bourg near Lyons, where the trial of Dumollard is now proceeding. This miscreant has prowled the country for years in quest of female servants seeking employ, enticing his victims into secluded by-lanes for rape, murder, and robbery. Upwards of 14 corpses he had hidden in unblessed graves, having turned up in damning evidence against him, and nothing half so cold-blooded in the annals of depravity has been known. His father, it seems, has been a malefactor of the deepest dye in Hungary." Appeal, attempt, and execution. Unsurprisingly, Dumoillard's appeal request was quickly rejected. Dumollard was informed that he would be executed by the guillotine. His response, "I like it better than to be like my father, quartered on a wheel being pulled in all directions by horses." Dumollard never repented. For his execution, an estimated 5,000 crowded around the guillotine to watch him to be beheaded. In France, the event was a sensation and was the only topic of conversation for the majority. From the Express of London, 10th of March 1862, the execution of Dumollard. The evening papers are full of details of the last moments of Dumollard. He was informed at 4 on Friday afternoon that the Court of Cassation had rejected his appeal and that he would be executed on Saturday morning. He answered quite coolly, "As well tomorrow as later." The chaplain of the prison and the curé of Bourg came to visit him a few minutes afterwards, and he promised them that he would confess before he died. That expression must be understood as referring to the sacrament of confession according to the Romish Church, and not to any public revelation of his crimes, for all the accounts confirm the telegraphic statement that he made none. At 6 o'clock his irons were struck off, and he seemed greatly pleased at this relief. He asked to see his wife, whom he had hitherto refused to see, took supper with her in the presence of the chaplain, and was formally reconciled. He spoke to her very sensibly, and advised her, if she should obtain a pardon, not to go back to her old home, because she would be pointed at. When the time came for setting out for the place of execution, he was allowed to change the prison dress for his own clothes. He picked out the worst for his own wear and put aside the others, saying that they were for his wife. At 11 o'clock he left the Bourg prison in a cart spread with straw, and accompanied by the chaplain and 2 gendarmes, travelled through the dead of night, arriving at Monteleur at 4 in the morning. During the journey his conversation turned upon the most trivial subjects. He calculated distances, spoke a good deal of his furniture, and said that somebody at Daguerre, whose name he mentioned, owed him several days' work, which he reckoned up to amounting to 27 francs. On observing the crowd as he passed through Chalamont, he said, "They are very curious to see me die." On arriving at Montleur, he was placed in a room prepared for him at the Hotel de Ville, the lock-up house being out of order. His first request was to have some fire to warm his feet. A cup of coffee and a glug of sherry were then given to him, which he nipped with much relish, taking especially care to melt the sugar. On the curé of Montleur being presented to him, he said, "I know I am very guilty for having followed bad advice, but I pay for others." After this, he was alone for nearly an hour and a half with the curé and the chaplain, and whatever confession he made must have been at this interview. At 6 o'clock, the justice of the peace, who had arrested him and who was charged with the direction of the execution, informed the two priests that the hour was approaching. He afterwards pressed Dumollard with many questions, urging him to make a full confession, but the latter replied that he had nothing more to say, and that if he had any declaration to make, he should not have waited for that before his execution. He repeated frequently, "I pay for others." He remained quite firm until the executioners made the fatal toilet. Then it was observed that his nerves seemed to fail him a little. He, however, insisted on walking to the scaffold, although a carriage was in readiness. His waistcoat was thrown over his shoulder to keep him warm, and he mounted the steps of the scaffold with assistance, embraced the chaplain, and helped the executioner take off his coat, and all was over. According to one account, there were shouts resembling hurrahs among the crowd. Dumollard's head was sent to the medical school of Lyon. Put bluntly in a French publication, Dumollard was shortened this morning. He made no confession and died impenitent.
Case 5. The French Ripper, 1863. Today's episode looks at brutal crimes of what has historically become known as the French Ripper, Joseph Philippe, but which at the time were referred to as the Terror of Paris. The brutal series of murders took place in Paris some 25 years earlier than Whitechapel's Jack. A thirst for blood that targeted unfortunates in the lower classes of Paris was a hallmark of Philippe, similar to Whitechapel Jack. But Philippe did not limit himself to one small area of Paris. Known at the time as the Terror of Paris, Philippe's proven killing spree lasted some 3 years. He was suspected in the end of having killed at least 23 women, although there are questions of potentially many more in Algiers as reports begin to spread of several mysterious deaths during his time there.
In 1888, whilst London was dealing with the horrific crimes of Jack the Ripper, and police, papers, and the public were trying to come to grips with the series of grisly murders found on the streets of Whitechapel, the Evening News recalled a similar, if not worse, series of killings that had taken place in Paris some 25 years previously. The French Ripper. From the Evening News, the 12th of October, 1888. On the morning of January the 9th, 1866, the inhabitants of the French capital were thrown into a state of consternation by the report of a crime which was the 10th of its kind committed within the space of the previous 3 years. The murder of Marie Bordeaux, closing the series of 10, had been perpetrated with a boldness that became appalling. He had selected a victim on the ground floor in the very premises which was occupied by the police station. This murder took place notwithstanding his knowledge of the police being in possession of a detailed description of his appearance, which had been furnished more than 18 months before by a girl who, by singular instance of presence, had escaped his clutches. Nor was his appearance such as to pass unnoticed in a crowd. Without laying much stress on the thick black hair and beard, the latter of which he might have shaved if he had wished, Joseph Philippe, as he turned out to be, was deeply pitted with smallpox, and had in addition a tattoo mark on the right arm, impossible to be effaced. Nevertheless, he had managed to baffle the police for 3 years, during which at least 10 human beings had been done to death by him. During this time, a number of mutilated and truncated corpses had been found in various out-of-the-way places of the metropolis, for, unlike Jack the Ripper, Philippe neither confined himself to one particular neighbourhood, nor to one particular mode of procedure. His lust for blood was induced by what has already been termed erotic catalepsy, and complicated by cupidity, although the latter was merely a means to an end. In other words, to obtain the wherewithal to indulge in his debauches and his cravings for intoxicants. There is, however, no doubt that the height of his fiendish lasciviousness was the agony of his victims as they weltered in their blood. Consequently, he did not disdain to track his prey among the better class of unfortunates, but, to use a vulgar expression, everything was fish that came to his net. Home or no home to which to take him was a matter of indifference as long as he saw his way to accomplish his all-pervading idea, murder under the pretext of caressing. None felt safe, and the newspapers of the time had to record a panic throughout the whole of Paris, similar to that which I have already mentioned as prevailing in the neighbourhood of Whitechapel. So much was this the terror of Paris between 1863 and 1866. Unlike Jack the Ripper, descriptions which were vague, the police had detailed accounts of the man they were looking for. Much was made of his pock-marked face and the tattoo on his arm born under a bad star. Although Philippe is aware that the police have a detailed description of him, he has no issue whatever of killing one of his targets in the same building shared by the police. Philippe had been in the regiment where he served honourably for a time. He reportedly had a love for absinthe. With his misdeeds whilst in the service, he was sent to Algeria for a year as punishment. Here, some of the local prostitutes mysteriously vanish or are found slaughtered. From the Evening News, the 12th of October 1888, the prisoner's appearance and antecedents correspond with the last epoch of his history. He is a short, thick-set man with black hair, closely cut beard and moustache, low forehead, deep-set eyes, thick lips, and a generally ferocious look, although dressed in the garb of a well-to-do workman. According to eyewitnesses, The prisoner, notwithstanding his scarred face, is by no means repulsive. His features, when unmoved by passion or drink, betray nothing of the fiendish, bloodthirsty manias that sway him at his dangerous moments. Their opinion agrees with the evidence of his former employers, all of whom testify to his invariably good temper, honesty, and activity when not under the influence of drink. They are further borne out by the military authorities, who state that until drunkenness set its seal upon him, he served with credit to himself and to the satisfaction of his superiors. But a year after his admission to the ranks, he began to misconduct himself, and he was sentenced to 1 year's imprisonment. And after his liberation, he was transferred to the punishment battalion in Algeria. He remained there until his final discharge in 1860. On his discharge, Philippe moves to Paris in 1860. A trail of hideous crimes begin to take place in Paris from 1861, mostly against women of the poorer classes. Paris's most famous detective of the time, Monsieur Claude, is on the case, but despite quite clear descriptions of the killer from the few women who have managed to escape his attack, the terror of Paris, as Philippe becomes known, remains free to kill again. Although suspected of 23 killings in Paris alone, for the purpose of conviction, the prosecution focuses on the 3 latest crimes. Julie Robert. On April the 18th, 1864, Julie Robert, a prostitute, is found slaughtered in her bed. The scene is a blood-soaked tableau of horror. From the Dublin Daily Express, the 3rd of July, 1866, wholesale murder. On the 15th of April, the Commissary of Police of the quarter of Dumollard was informed that a woman called Julie Robert, aged 30, and lodging in the first floor of a house in the Rue Saint-Joseph, had given no signs of life for 2 days. On forcing the door, the woman was found dead upon her bed. Her head had been nearly severed from her body with a sharp instrument. Death must have been almost instantaneous. Julie Robert was partly undressed. The murderer, after the crime, had searched the pocket of his victim and the different drawers in the room, but a purse containing 1,300 livres had escaped his notice. Near the bed was found a basin in which the assassin had washed his hands. This case, similar to many other cases found through the vastness of Paris, showed the same hallmarks of murder. The neck was slashed deeply and with no hesitancy. A basin of water nearby was filled with bloody water. The murder victim, one of the many unfortunates attempting to eke out a living in Paris. The next case takes place in November 1864. From the Dublin Daily Express, the 3rd of July 1866, wholesale murder. The woman, Mage, aged 32 years, lived in the Rue Saint-Antoine in the house of ill fame with her son, Henry Mage, aged 2 years. On the 5th of November 1864, a man with a blouse and cap spoke to her. They went into the house together, but the woman, Mage, disliking the man's appearance, gave her money to another woman to hold. Half an hour afterwards, the lodgers heard a man go downstairs, after having thrown the key on the landing. At daybreak, a long streak of blood was seen running from Fleur Mage's window. Her door key found on the landing was handed to Lemon, the lover of the murdered woman. On the door being opened, a fearful sight presented itself. The woman, Mage, and her child had been hacked in a manner too horrible to describe. Fleur Mage's throat had been cut with a strong hand. Still, she had managed to crawl to the window where she had been seen, but she was unable to call out. The child had evidently cried. He had been stabbed in the mouth. The room had been pillaged. The murderer then flung the two corpses together, got a basin, and washed his hands. The struggle must have been a severe one, for the cat was found crushed between the bed and the wall. There can be no doubt that Philippe committed this double crime, for he was seen by another woman to whom he had spoken on the night in question, walking with Fleur Mage, and this girl proved his identity by declaring that the man had on his arm ne sous un mauvaise étoile, and Philippe is thus tattooed. Roughly translated, it means born under a bad star. The next two cases were the ones that would finally enable the capture of Joseph Philippe. From the Dunfermline Saturday Press, the 27th of January 1866, a Paris tragedy. The murder of the woman in the Rue Ville-l'Évêque in Paris has been arrested by the police. Joseph Philippe, for such is the man's name, went to the other side of the Seine and attempted to kill another woman who resisted so strongly that the assassin made off, but was captured after a hot chase in the Rue Jacob. The police at once saw that they had caught no common malefactor, and after a careful search found items that had belonged to Marie Victoria Bordeaux. The lover of that woman was sent for, and he recognized her purse, which was empty. Philip was taken to the morgue and confronted with his victim, who was lying there in a state of nudity, with her throat fearfully gashed. For some time he withstood this test, but finally he made a clean breast of it. It appears that Marie Victoria, whilst under the knife of the murderer, kept striking with her hand against the wall, but the neighbours, accustomed to violent scenes in the next room, took no notice of this death signal. Even after Joseph Philippe had left the house, the poor woman managed to crawl to the window, and she was seen by some people in the street to raise herself up and then fall back. They thought the woman was drunk and passed on. Although Philippe was clearly seen by others leaving the scene of the horrific crime, he remains at large. Undaunted, Philippe sets his sights beyond the usual class of prostitutes for his next victim. In January 1866, the police managed to cap Philippe as he escapes from another attempted killing that went wrong. Interestingly, in this case, which eventually caught him, he had changed his usual methodology and based the killing around a robbery. From the Dundee Advertiser, the 2nd of July 1860, a frightful chapter of crime. 23 murders by one man. On the 11th of January last, a middle-aged widow lady in Paris, Madame Midi, by profession a painter, narrowly escaped being murdered. A man who had lately been in her house as a workman in the employment of a frame maker whom she patronized was the intended murderer, and he had doubtless been tempted to the deed in order to rob his victim of some small but valuable paintings which had been entrusted to her by a Polish prince. On January the 11th, he presents himself at the lady's apartment to inquire for a tool he pretends to have left the last time he was working there. When the lady replies that she has seen no such tool, he draws from beneath his blouse a pillowcase, asking whether she can identify this as her property. The lady, wearied of his importunities, turns her head, and the intruder flings the pillowcase over it, intending to set to work in his usual manner, namely, to strangle her partially before cutting her throat. In her desperate efforts to free herself from her assailant's grip, Madame Midi firmly sets her teeth in the hand which was endeavouring to stifle her cries. Fortunately, her studio is only divided by a thin partition from another one, and the neighbour, hearing the noise of a struggle, rushes to the rescue. He knocks at the door, and receiving no answer, flings open the window on the landing overlooking the courtyard and shouts for the concierge, after which he knocks again. This time the door is opened by an individual who, in the coolest way imaginable, tells him, Madame Midi has suddenly taken ill. I'm going for the doctor. I don't think it is much. With apparent calmness, he proceeds downstairs until he hears the cries of Madame Midi, "Stop him! Stop him!" as he is crossing the courtyard. He then takes to his heels, but in vain, because before he has reached the Rue Jacob, he is arrested. A tremendously long-bladed knife is found upon him, and the search in his room reveals, besides many blood-stained garments, the purse of Marie Bordeaux and the empty razor case. The police soon identified him as the man who was wanted for a horrid murder committed a few days before, that of Marie Victoria Bordeaux. A little more investigation proved that their prisoner, Joseph Philippe by name, to be one of those great criminals of the Dumollard type, who committed murder by wholesale, partly from pure bloodthirstiness of nature, and partly for the plunder and outrage of their victims. Joseph Philippe selected for his operations the class of unfortunates whose degradation and isolation and the peculiarities of their miserable trade exposed them in a high degree to the danger of assassination. The prisoner is the first to have seen in these facts of unfortunates the chance of a living. From the evidence now obtained, it is certain that he did act on a system. More than 2 years ago, he revealed his secrets to one of these females in the weakness of intoxication. "I love women well," he said, "and I do for them well. I stuff their mouths and cut their throats. Wait a bit, and you will hear me talked about. What passed for a grim jest has become a too horrid reality." Several unfortunates had perished in Paris since 1861, strangled or with their throats cut, but it is only within the last 2 years that cases have been found in which there is proof against the prisoner. With his being caught red-handed and his subsequent confession at the morgue of the murder of Marie Victoria Bordeaux, Philippe is brought to trial. Although it is generally believed Philippe is responsible for more than 20 killings spread throughout Paris, for the purpose of establishing a conviction, he is tried only on the last 4 killings: Julie Roger, Flore Mage and her 2-year-old son, and Marie Bordeaux. The prosecution feel strongly that the evidence within these 4 counts of murder is overwhelming. Within the trial, there are upwards of 60 witnesses, including 3 women who had managed to avoid or escape his advances. Several items found in his lodgings are known to have belonged to various victims and are identified by friends and family. Throughout the trial, Philippe maintains his composure. From The Sun, London, the 28th of June, 1866. There are upwards of 60 witnesses in support of the charges of murder against Philippe, now in course of investigation before the Court of Assizes in La Seine. The evidence first taken by the court was in reference to the murder of the girl Julie Robert, called, for distinction's sake, the murder of the Rue Saint-Joseph. Several articles found in the prisoner's lodgings were identified as having belonged to the deceased girl. The president put questions having reference to all the 5 murders for which the prisoner is being tried. The result is that he acknowledges some and denies the others. The president asked him to give details regarding them. The prisoner replied, "All this confuses me. I should be afraid of not telling the truth if I were to seek to recall to memory old recollections now nearly effaced from it." As expected, Philippe is found guilty, and Paris breathes a sigh of relief. From the Dublin Evening Post, the 30th of June, 1866, trial for murder in France. The trial for the murder of Philippe has been brought to a close, and the man who a week ago was smoking cigarettes in his cell is now condemned to death for having assassinated Marie Victoria Bordeaux and attempting to kill widow Midi. The prisoner was accused in the indictment of having also murdered a woman called Mage and her child, and a girl, Julie Robert. Philippe acknowledged the first 2 crimes, but called God to witness that the murders of 1864 were not his work, and the jury acquitted him on those counts. Although the circumstantial evidence ran very strongly against the prisoner, and there were many points of resemblance between those murders and the ones he confessed to. On every possible occasion, Philippe protested that he was no robber, and he repeated this assertion when asked what he had to say after he was condemned to death. He heard sentence passed without showing any symptom of emotion, and had instructed his counsel not to plead for his life, as it was his wish to die. It is generally supposed that Philippe had slaughtered 23 women of bad reputation, but out of the lot, only 4 crimes were selected by the public prosecutor, and in 2 cases the prosecution broke down. So great is the difficulty of obtaining clues to the murder of women in the habit of receiving strangers. All that could be said in defence of Philippe was that he drank absinthe, and that it was under the influence of this noxious liquor that he committed the fearful crimes charged to him. Philippe, during the trial, showed the greatest self-possession. He spoke of the widow Midi as a respectable woman who would not have listened to his advances, and it is not improbable that had he confined his propensities to women not held respectable, he might still have been at large. His attempt on a respectable woman led to his apprehension and will lead to his death. The defense pleads homicidal mania, the result of erotic epilepsy. The force of bad example and the consequent impulse to the imitation of two other murders of unfortunates who were, however, prompted by different motives, the one by greed, pure and simple, and the other by a kind of revenge on the whole of the sex, too horrid to be mentioned. The jury refused to be influenced by the plea, and in giving their verdict omit any and every mention of extenuating circumstances. The death of Joseph Philippe. Philippe is 34 at the time of his death. As he awaits his meeting with Madame Guillotine, stories are recounted of his last days in his cell. Apparently, he is tormented by terrible nightmares every night. It is the general belief that his nightly torment is the spirits of the many women he has killed. Joseph Philippe's name, which was infamous in its day both in France and England, comes back to prominence 25 years later as police scour the streets to find the identity of Jack the Ripper. From the Evening News, the 12th of October, 1888. Joseph Philippe was but 34 when he was guillotined. He met his death like a man. In fact, psychologists have since declared that the reaction which set in after his capture was tantamount to the wish of having done with life as soon as possible. He knew that if even his life was spared, there would be no chance of indulging the fiendish cravings that during the latter years had been the sole incentive to live. Drink was necessary to him to drown the frightful apparitions that, according to some of his employers, haunted him already before his arrest, and he knew that drink could not be obtained.
Case 6. The French Ogress, 1905 to 1908. In this episode, we investigate the crimes of Jean Weber, the French Ogress. Her story, incorporating the deaths of at least 10 children, but suspected of having killed at least 20 children between 1906 and 1908 in France, was so sensational it was picked up nationally within England. Jean Weber was originally accused of killing 5 children, but was acquitted. She was then accused of again killing another child, but was again acquitted. It was not until she was caught in the act of killing yet another child that she was finally convicted. The case, which gripped the papers, highlighted failures with medical expert testimony at the time, questions about the judicial system in place, and the psychological mental illness of compulsively killing children. Jean Weber, the French Ogress, the suspected 20 killings to her name.
Jean Weber was born in northern France to a poor family in 1875. She left home at age 14, where she took on a succession of menial jobs. Throughout the various cases, there are accusations of her having a propensity to drink heavily, but alcoholism was not brought forward as a determining factor in any of the cases. There are also news reports of Jean having drifted in and out of prostitution, partly based on a police report of vagrancy. Jean Weber first came to international attention with her trial at the Assizes in Paris. From the London Evening Standard, the 30th of January 1906, a problem in criminology. Paris has got a cause célèbre after having been without one for months. The case of the Ogress of the human enigma, which is being tried at the Assizes of the Seine. The case is really too much of an enigma and refers to people of much too ordinary habits to allow tongues to wag as they can in Paris. Still, it is a cause célèbre. Jean Weber, the wife of a workman, is charged with having murdered 5 children and with having attempted to murder a 6th. 3 were children of her brother, 1 was her own, and the 5th was that of a neighbour. The child whose life it is said she attempted to take was one of her nephews. The first suspicious death, that of a niece aged 2, took place on March the 2nd. On March the 11th, a sister of the child, 3 years old, died suddenly. On the 25th, a niece less than a year old died, and 4 days later, the woman's own son, 11 years old, died. On April the 5th, a nephew, 11 months old, was left in care of Jean Weber and almost died. The child was taken to hospital, where the doctor told the mother that it had been strangled. A case was made out against Jean Weber, and the magistrate found in examination that the neighbour's child had died in her arms very suddenly in 1902. The other 4 suspicious deaths were cited against her, and she was committed to trial at the assizes. In one case only, the case of the nephew who escaped, there is some material evidence, but it is slight and contradictory. The charge against the woman in the other cases is upheld by the facts that the children all died suddenly when she was alone with them. There is no evidence of poisoning, and only a suggestion of evidence of strangling, someone having seen the woman tie a scarf around the neck of one of the children. The doctors had in no case been able to swear that death was due to crime, and this the prosecution admit. Students of criminology suggest 3 solutions to the enigma. First comes the suggestion that Jean Weber was caused much mental suffering by the death of her first children. Her first 2 children died suddenly, and that she developed a homicidal, or rather infanticidal, mania. Her honesty and respectability in all family matters, about which everyone agrees, supports this theory, as also the medical evidence that her parents and grandparents had all suffered from heart disease, and she herself had had nervous failings. The second theory, that she is a criminal, is somewhat cleverer than others, and the third theory is that the deaths were coincidental. Most of the time today was taken up by the interrogation. The woman answered the judge's questions without faltering. There was no anger in her tone and no querulousness, but she was firm and precise. She contested several of the details cited and renounced all claims of mental weakness. The day was, if anything, favourable to her, for the prosecution did not gain a single point. To prove the woman guilty is a large order, but how to assert and explain her innocence? This is what Paris is asking itself with an unpleasant kind of excitement. Weber manages to come across well under heavy prosecution attacks. The possibility that the rapid succession of deaths of children in her care is just an unfortunate coincidence is given tremendous support by 2 doctors in their expert medical testimony. From the London Evening Standard, the 31st of January 1906, Jean Weber acquitted. The trial of Jean Weber ended rather unexpectedly today. After 20 witnesses had been heard, 2 doctors were called to give fresh evidence on the death of the children. They were Dr. Brugadel, one of the best-known practitioners in Paris, and Dr. Thiernon, another clever doctor, although not as well known. Dr. Brugadel said that the children might have been suffocated, or they might have died of convulsions. They had not all died in the same way, and the marks on their necks did not prove anything. In fact, the marks left by congestion were often like those which would be caused by strangulation. Dr. Thurinel confirmed his evidence and said that he believed that none of the children had been strangled or suffocated. The two doctors, I must explain, had been appointed by the magistrates to give independent and expert evidence. They not only confirmed what a dozen other doctors had said, but were more positive. Dr. Mosh, who gave evidence for the prosecution, refused to give his opinion on any one of the deaths, pleading that was keeping a professional secret, and Dr. Silvestre, another witness for the prosecution, said that he had never spoken of strangulation. All the expert evidence weighed, therefore, against the prosecution. The evidence of the parents of the children had been no more favourable to the prosecution. Contradictions were, indeed, numerous. It is, therefore, hardly surprising that the public prosecutor should throw up his brief after the evidence of the two independent medical experts. The jury immediately found the prisoner not guilty, and she was acquitted. A verdict of guilty would have been surprising after the evidence given yesterday, but few expected the acquittal so suddenly. The court applauded the verdict. The court case had been the news of all Paris. Upon her acquittal, Weber changed her name to Madame Moulinier and left Paris to move to northern France. Here she managed to obtain a job in childcare for the Bavousier family, looking after 9-year-old Auguste. It was not long before little Auguste was dead. Weber's true identity was soon revealed, and another charge of murder was laid against her. Once again, Weber was saved by expert medical testimony, which concluded that Auguste had died of typhoid despite the bruising around his neck. Weber once again looked to distance herself. There were some who believed that she was a wronged, unfortunate woman who was being hounded by a sensationalist press looking for a story. From the London Evening Standard, the 3rd of January 1908, the case of Jean Weber. The press, which at one time joined in a chorus of denunciation against the woman whom somebody playfully called the Ogress, is now beginning to grow disgusted at the judicial persecution to which she is being subjected. After being tried and acquitted on the charge of child murder, she changed her name and lived for a time in a family where she was much loved for her gentle character. Unfortunately, one of the children died, and another little girl, about 10, accused Jean Weber of having strangled it. There was not a shred of corroborative evidence, yet the corpse was exhumed. Half a dozen doctors testified that there was no signs whatever of violence. Nevertheless, the provincial juge d'instruction was both loath to let such a chance of notoriety slip, and has used every legal device to keep Jean Weber in prison and to subject her to the usual inquisitorial examination. It is characteristic of the way of proceedings of the juge d'instruction that he carefully conceals the fact that the medical evidence has completely exonerated his prisoner, and to address her as if her guilt was proved. In her last interrogatory, she said pathetically, "I am the victim of of an incomprehensible fatality. Why should I not tell the truth? I do not value either liberty or life. What should I do with liberty? Nothing in the world would induce me to enter a house where there were children. I am Jean Weber, the Ogress, to the end now. Believe me, sir, my mind is made up. I tried to drown myself once, but was taken out of the Seine before death had overtaken me. I shall do it again, and in the country, somewhere in the fields where nobody is. I shall either hang or drown myself. It will be a deliverance for me. At last, several papers are crying out against hounding a woman to death in this fashion, and several have strong articles today, which shows to what extent the French judicial procedures can be abused. From sympathetic friends who believed in her innocence, Weber is given a job as an orderly in a children's hospital, with the new name of Marie Lemonnier. Weber was at the home for less than a week before she was suspected of attempting to strangle a child residing there. Weber is quietly dismissed. The case is not reported. Weber moves back to Paris, where she is picked up for vagrancy and temporarily placed in the asylum of Nanterre. Weber is examined briefly before she is released as sane. Investigations into her antecedent state is that she survived by working as a prostitute. With a new common law husband, the pair are next seen in Commercy in May 1908, where, while staying at the inn, it happens again. From the London Evening Standard, the 11th of May 1908, Infanticide Mania. After 2 acquittal charges of having murdered 6 little children, 2 of her own, 3 nieces, and a boy whose nurse she was, the woman Jean Weber is again in prison, accused of the murder of a little boy of 7. 2 days ago, bearing another name of Johanna Weber, she took a room at an inn at Commercy, kept by a couple named Poirot. At bedtime, saying she was afraid to sleep alone, Jean Weber asked the landlady to let her child, a boy of 7, named Marcel, sleep with her. The mother agreed and put the child in bed. An hour or 2 later, another woman staying in the house heard groans from Jean Weber's room and heard the woman move about. She knocked at the door to ask what was the matter, and, getting an unsatisfactory answer, called Monsieur and Madame Poirot, and with them pushed her way into the room. The child lay dead on the bed, and marks on his neck showed that he had been strangled. The police were sent for, and soon after her arrest, the woman confessed that her name was Jean Weber. Meanwhile, a crowd had gathered round the house, and so desperate were the attempts made to get at her that the authorities were obliged to smuggle her away from Commercy in a motor car to the prison of the military town of Saint-Mihiel. The news of this 7th murder has created an outcry in Paris and all over the country. With Weber practically caught in the act of killing the child, and given the previous expert medical testimony that had led to her 2 previous acquittals, all of France waits to hear the results of the autopsy with the Poirot child. From the London Evening Standard, the 13th of May 1908, the case of Jean Weber. Conflicting evidence. The second examination of the body of the child Poirot, doctors Michel and Parisot, is said to have led to the same conclusion as the first, namely, that death was caused by strangulation. The father of the supposed victims of Jean Weber has now lodged a complaint against Dr. Asher, who, that time in 1905, gave it as his opinion that the child had died a natural death. Dr. Asher professes himself perfectly tranquil, the more so since the verdict was endorsed by the celebrity authorities of Doctors Brunadel and Therinot. It was on the opinion of these two princes of science that Jean Weber was liberated. A most significant witness had just come forward in the person of a midwife who attended Jean Weber in her first confinement. She says that when the child died at 11 months old from convulsions, the grief of the mother was unexampled. The consequence was that she fell ill, and her brain seemed to have turned. Every day she would go to the cemetery with a basket of dainties and lay them on the grave. One day I met her coming back and began to talk to her. As I came across some other children playing, she said to me with a wild look and a changed voice, "I cannot bear to look at other people's children when my child Margaret is in heaven. I feel a longing to stifle them in my arms. It would do good and calm me. I cannot see them alive, and it is joy to me to look at them dead." This would seem to prove that, at any rate, that at the time Jean Weber was not fit to be left alone with children, but it cannot prove her guilt against all the resources of science that have proclaimed her innocence in previous cases. As France grapples with the question of how a killing machine was put to trial twice before and managed to elude conviction is once again before the courts, the public and press remain both repelled and fascinated by the serial killer of children. From the Farnworth Chronicle, the 16th of May, 1908, Ogress or victim, woman's third arrest for child killing. On Saturday, there was arrested at Commercy in France a woman, Jean Weber, on a charge of strangling a child. This is the latest development in one of the most remarkable series of tragedies. Jean Weber is called the Ogress because of the number of children who have died after she has had charge of them. Twice before, she has been tried for her life for child murder and has been acquitted. She is either the most unfortunate woman in the world or one of the most wicked. She first gained notoriety 2 years ago when she was denounced by her sisters-in-law as a murderess. She was accused of the horrible crime of having strangled 2 of her own children and 2 of her little nephews. In each case, the child had died after it had been alone with Jean Weber. Now, 3 months after her last trial, the extraordinary has happened, and Jean Weber seems likely again to face the magistrate on a charge of child murder. The medical doctors from the previous cases are re-evaluated. Theories are placed forward as to how Weber managed to kill the children without leaving marks obvious enough to convict her. From the Nottingham Evening Post, 16th of May, 1908, Strangler's Cunning, the Methods of Jean Weber. The diabolical skill, amounting almost to science, with which the boy Poirot was strangled by the ogress Jean Weber has been explained in great detail to an interviewer by Dr. Thierry, one of the experts who examined the body of the little victim. Every cunning precaution seems to have been taken to avoid leaving any trace of the crime, and the manner in which the handkerchief was rolled was calculated to leave the slightest possible marks, and even these would be hardly distinguishable after a short lapse of time. At the nape of the neck was a space about 2.5 inches wide, where no marks of any kind was visible. Dr. Infers said that it was here that Jean slowly and gradually tightened the handkerchief with such infinite caution that she had not been taken virtually red-handed under circumstances which enabled a medical man to follow quickly. She had every chance of again escaping the consequences of her crime. Investigations into Weber's history show that several other children have in all probability narrowly escaped the fate of Poirot. Weber's third trial gripped the papers across France and across England. English papers are rather judgmental as to the perceived failures of the French judicial system. From the Cornish Telegraph, the 21st of May 1908, woman who strangled 6 children. French police have in custody one of the most extraordinary criminals of recent times. She is called Jean Weber, and at various times has been charged with strangling 6 children, amongst them her nephew and nieces. Each time she was acquitted, as it was never possible to satisfy courts as to her guilt. There was a remarkable conflict of medical testimony, but as each fresh case came before the courts, public opinion deepened with certainty that the woman had strangled the children. Apart from the suspicion which naturally attached to her in reference to the mysterious deaths of these children, the woman's character was notoriously bad, and her further association with these terrible incidents earned her the epithet Ogress from the French people. 5 days ago, a fresh crime came to light. A woman came with a tramp to stay at a provincial inn in France. One night the tramp had been absent from the inn, having got work, and the woman, saying that she disliked to sleep alone, obtained the consent of the innkeeper and his wife that their 7-year-old son should sleep with her. After the first night, the child rebelled against the arrangement, but he was overruled by the parents and was allowed once more to spend the night in the woman's room. At about 11 o'clock the same night, a woman occupying an adjacent room heard curious noises proceeding from the visitor's chamber. There was gasping and gurgling and stifled sobbing. Thoroughly alarmed, she went downstairs and summoned the father and mother of the child. The anxious couple proceeded immediately upstairs and knocked at the stranger's door. Getting no reply, they entered. The woman was fast asleep on the bed with her arm around the neck of the child. The little boy was quite dead, his tongue protruding from his mouth, which was covered with blood. On the bed were 2 handkerchiefs knotted together and also soaked with blood. Later examination showed that the child's tongue had been bitten through and that an attempt had been made to clear up bloodstains in the room. The woman was aroused and answered her questioners in a dazed fashion. She professed to know nothing about the matter. Under pressure, however, she admitted that the name she had given was a false one, and that she was the notorious Jean Weber, the so-called Ogress. The police were communicated with, and the woman was immediately arrested and with difficulty preserved from the violence of the mob. The result of this trial, despite an excellent defence effort, would clearly be a conviction, with the preponderance of evidence at the prosecution's disposal. The question became more to do with Weber's sanity. From the Globe, the 25th of November 1908, French Ogress found guilty. Jean Weber, who has acquired a sinister notoriety as the Ogress, had been found guilty of strangling several children. Medical experts, however, wrote his Paris correspondent states, regard her as not responsible for her actions, and she will be consigned to a lunatic asylum. Jean Weber was accused of murdering 7 children and has 3 times been acquitted. 2 of the victims were her own children, and 3 were her nieces. The boy Marcel Poirot, aged 7, of whose murder she has now been convicted, was killed with great cruelty. Under an assumed name, Weber lodged at his parents' house, and saying that she was afraid to sleep alone, begged that the boy might share her room. In the night, strange sounds were heard, and going to the room, the parents found their child dead, having evidently been strangled. In the cases of the other children, there was much difficulty in establishing the precise cause of death. Weber was sent to the asylum at Maryville, where she remained for 2 years before committing suicide in 1910. The story that circulated was that she had manually strangled herself with her own hands around her neck and her fingernails bedded into the skin. This is not medically probable, although she may have strangled herself. Historically, she is suspected of potentially having killed more than 20 children in her history.
Further particulars. Of course, not all French misdeeds involved ogresses, garottings, or an unfortunate abundance of children. Some were altogether more civilized, if equally lethal, which brings us to our next tale, a herbalist of Paris, a suspiciously expensive botanic excursion, and a potion that proved rather too effective. From the Dover Express, the 13th of April, 1894, an herb doctor in trouble. The herb doctors of Paris have been rather prominent in the police courts of late. Another one finds himself in an uncomfortable position by the sudden death of a woman whom he had attended. He has been arrested on several charges. The deceased had suffered from a tumour and, not satisfied with the advice of several qualified medical practitioners in her neighbourhood, she sent for the herbalist, who visited her for a considerable time and seems to have gained complete ascendancy over her. He obtained large fees from his patient and induced her to give a special one of £40, approximate value £6,700 in 2025, to enable him to go to the Pyrenees in search of a rare medicinal plant. He returned from his alleged trip in 4 days, gave the patient a portion, and she died 12 hours after having taken it. If you've enjoyed this descent into the more sinister corners of old France, do consider liking, subscribing, and sharing this episode, particularly with someone who owns an antique absinthe spoon or once flirted with becoming a mime. Every click thoroughly bewilders the YouTube algorithm, which currently believes we're a cheese appreciation channel running by a talking accordion. Let's keep it confused, shall we? This has been News of the Times, and I'm Robin Coles, turning out the lamps while secrets slip out the side door.